Rumors of money laundering have circled Donald Trump's golf business for years. Now, Forbes has uncovered the true source of the funds. Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, Brittany. Thank you for having me.
Of course, you wrote and reported how Donald Trump built a golf empire with secret financing. So we know the former president has golf clubs all over the world, but when and where did his interest in owning and starting golf clubs originate?
Well, it was interesting. Golf started when he was about in college, and then he joined a really famous club north of New York City called Winged Foot. He was a member there for a while. But you know Donald Trump, he always wants to be the guy. He wants to be the one who owns it. And so starting in the late 90s, he really started expanding into golf courses. And his first one was Trump International down just outside of Palm Beach, down in Florida. And this was on the heels of Mar-a-Lago. So he already had a private club. But Mar-a-Lago, although it's huge, it's like 17 or 18 acres, it doesn't have any golf. So then he started a golf club about 15 minutes west of Mar-a-Lago. And then the expansion just sort of rolled on from there to the point now where he has 10 courses, 4 resorts, plus Mar-a-Lago.
A lot of properties there. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at Mar-a-Lago, arguably one of his most famous properties, the Winter White House. It was also known as when he was president in his first term. So how much did he originally spend on the Mar-a-Lago property?
He bought Mar-a-Lago for about $8 million. Now, at the time, that seemed like a fair chunk of change. Mar-a-Lago was sort of this aging estate that people had struggled to figure out what to do with it because it was just so big and so expensive to maintain. Trump buys it in 1985. For 10 years, he has it as a home. This is sort of the go-go years of Donald Trump. Lots of expansion in Atlantic City. He's got a yacht, he's got a football team, and he's got Mar-a-Lago. He loses many of those assets, but he hangs on to Mar-a-Lago. And in 1995, he converts it into a private club. So it's inviting other people into his home, and they pay him huge amounts of money to do so, and ultimately it becomes a really profitable business.
So then you mentioned that he made a golf course up the road. Talk about that a little bit. How much did he pay for it? How much was he making? What did that look like?
Well, the real trick of Donald Trump's expansion into the golf business early in his career is Donald Trump at the time was having trouble getting financing because he had just had several of his casino entities declare bankruptcy, and banks were pretty skeptical of this guy. But he found this industry that he liked because he liked playing golf, and he also liked because it had this unusual form of financing, which was collecting what are called membership liabilities. So here's how it would work. So somebody starts a club, and then they say to a bunch of rich people, hey, if you join this club, then you can pay an initiation fee. Let's say it's $100,000. And everybody dumps in $100,000. And then they say, okay, but in 30 years, you can get that money back. So it's really like a loan. But here's the great thing about it from the developer's perspective. Unlike a bank loan, first of all, there's no interest. Okay, so this is essentially free money. And Trump can do whatever he wants with it for 30 years. And secondly, there's no mortgage. So nobody even knows that you have the liability on your balance sheet. This allows Trump to have huge amounts of cash coming into his business, which then he can use to buy, develop, and build these spectacular courses with other people's money.
Sounds like an interesting workaround. And if you're making $100,000 per member, that sounds like a lot. So how much was he making on these deposits alone?
It adds up to real money. And if you look per property, he's looking at roughly $30 or $40 million per place. And then after what we'll call sort of his first wave of golf expansion and club expansion. So this is Mar-a-Lago, Bedminster. He's got a course up in Westchester County. He has the one down in Palm Beach. That sort of initial wave, Donald Trump accumulates roughly $150 million of membership liabilities by charging these small initiation fees to various people. Remember, $100,000 doesn't sound like very much, but when you have hundreds, thousands of people joining this club, all of a sudden the numbers start to get really big. And for Trump, it becomes a significant liability on his balance sheet, but also enables a huge expansion of his business.
So talk about just how big that expansion was from Mar-a-Lago, from Florida. Where are these clubs cropping up? And is he financing all of them through these membership initiation fees?
Initially, he is financing most of them that way, and they're cropping up in the sorts of places that you see Donald Trump, right? So he has one in Palm Beach, he has a couple outside of New York City, one in Westchester County, one a little bit west in Bedminster, New Jersey. And then he also has one that was financed a different way, which is outside of Los Angeles. Now, that club is an interesting story. That one was somebody was trying to build it, and they ran into all sorts of problems because one of the holes actually fell off the cliff and into the ocean. And so the earlier developer wasn't able to finish the project. There were all sorts of problems. Donald Trump ends up purchasing that property. Now, in that case, it's a public course, so he couldn't collect these membership liabilities. But he did get a lot of land around the course as part of the deal, and he ends up selling those parcels of land as residential lots, collecting more than $75 million that way, which then apparently helps him fund the overall construction of the course, in addition to a bank loan that he took too.
So then let's fast forward a couple of years, and the concept of this membership financing really begins to sour within the golf industry. So does Trump keep going? Does he make different moves? What does that look like?
Well, anytime that you hear somebody talk about a financing mechanism, that it's like, oh, this is such a brilliant idea. There's no interest on these liabilities. You're going to get all this free money. Anytime that something seems too good to be true, it might just be. And eventually people sour on this idea. They say, okay, so I can raise a bunch of money, but then if I want to sell these clubs in 5 years, then I'm selling them with this huge liability on the balance sheet, and nobody wants to buy my club. So you see the popularity of membership liabilities really start to fade away. And a lot of people get cold feet about these things. They don't really want to touch them. It makes these deals complicated. Donald Trump takes the opposite approach. He says, hey, if other people are backing away, I'm jumping right in. And this is an opportunity to buy up golf clubs at a discount. Now, interestingly, this sort of coincides also with the Great Recession eventually. So you have multiple reasons why there are huge discounts on these clubs. And Trump just starts traveling around the country, scooping them up, $2 million here, $3 million there. And ultimately, by about 2012, he suddenly has his portfolio of 10 golf clubs and is one of the largest individual investors in the golf business in the country.
So you said if something's too good to be true, it probably is. What were the benefits of him taking on these liabilities? And then did he ever run into trouble?
The benefits were that there weren't that many other people who were willing to do this. And so anytime that you have low demand, you're going to also have low costs. And so Trump gets a lot of these properties, large, significant properties, at huge discounts. Now, he also then does take on these significant liabilities. And yes, he does run into trouble. So the most interesting example is down in Florida at a course that's also not too far from Mar-a-Lago, but different than the one that he started in 1999, in a place called Jupiter. He takes on $41 million of membership liabilities when he buys this course and puts in about $5 million of his own cash. So the vast majority of the transaction is the acceptance of these membership liabilities. Now, Trump then starts playing hardball with the members. He says, okay, if you were on a list to get your liabilities back because you wanted to leave the club, you're no longer welcome at the club. Seems reasonable enough. And so some people stop going to the club. But if you're not going to the club, you also expect not to be paying dues to the club. And then Trump says, okay, not only are you not allowed at the club, but you still got to pay me dues. And so a group of these members get together and say, okay, this is ridiculous. And they sue Trump, and they ultimately beat him. And Trump has to pay about $6 million, including interest, back to these members, while still continuing to have significant liabilities from the other members on his balance sheet. So that one has been a little bit more complicated. But overall, this strategy has worked out okay for Trump because the golf business has done really, really well. Trump's had these huge liabilities on his balance sheet, but he hasn't really had to pay much of it back yet. And in the meantime, the business has improved enough that he should be able to fund the liabilities when people come knocking at his door and say, hey, remember that $100,000 I gave you 30 years ago? I want it back now.
I want to talk about a certain someone who was on the receiving end of Trump taking these liabilities, that person being former FBI director and special counsel Robert Mueller. Tell us that story.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating little story. So Mueller joins a club outside of Washington, D.C., just a few years before he becomes the FBI director. And he pays a membership initiation. And then a handful of years later, the club sells. In one of those deals that I was referencing, there was a low price deal in the middle of the recession. And the buyer is, of all people, Donald Trump. Now, at this point, Robert Mueller and Donald Trump don't have this inextricable link between them, okay? It's just that he's a member of this golf club. Mueller stays a member of the golf club for a couple of years. And then finally, he decides to leave the golf club. And when he leaves, he writes a note or reaches out to the club and says, hey, about that membership initiation fee, can I get some of that back? And somebody at the club responds to him and says, yeah, okay, we'll put your name on a waiting list. And they don't get back to him. So by the time that Mueller releases the report on Russian interference in 2019, he had not heard yet back from the Trump organization. Interestingly, Trump uses this whole connection throughout the investigation to somehow argue that Robert Mueller has a conflict of interest and is demanding money out of Trump or whatever. This argument's sort of laughed at by everybody, but nonetheless, it's this amazing connection between this financing mechanism that was sort of hiding below the radar in Trump's empire and Robert Mueller, the person who was sort of his chief antagonist for his early years in the White House.
And did Robert Mueller ever get his money back that you know of?
We don't know. So he joined in 1994, I believe it was. So we're 30 years away from that now. So it's possible that he would have gotten it back, but we just don't know. Of course, Robert Mueller provided the update when he wrote the report on Russian interference, but hasn't been providing regular updates about what's going on with his membership liability in the years since.
So let's go back to 2017. Trump just becomes president, and that's really when speculation and questions about the funding behind his golf empire really rise. So what caused that speculation?
So the big thing is that a couple of months after Trump takes office, there is a golf writer who is speaking with an NPR channel in Boston. And the NPR channel is asking him about his experiences writing about Donald Trump in the golf world over the years. And the writer, his name is James Dodson, shares a story with the NPR station and says, I was down in 2013 at one of Trump's golf courses in North Carolina. And I was going to golf with Trump. And we were talking a little bit after I arrived. And I said to Trump, hey, how is it that you have the money to pay for all of these golf courses? And honestly, it was kind of a silly question because Trump, in this case, had paid about $3 million in cash and assumed about $4 million of membership liabilities to buy the club. Okay, $3 million in cash for Donald Trump is nothing. This is a guy who not only does he have a $1 billion real estate empire, but also in these years was collecting significant amounts of money, more than $30 million a year, from being on The Apprentice and various licensing deals. So he had the cash. He also had liquidity at a time when other developers did not, because he was really a TV star in addition to being a developer. So he's getting cash coming in even during those difficult years in 2008, 2009, 2010. But nonetheless, he asked the question. And as he tells this radio station, Donald Trump sort of throws off that he has access to $100 million. And this writer gets curious about that. And so when he hops into a golf cart with Eric Trump, he says, hey, Eric, tell me more about the financing for this. And as he later recounts it, Eric says, well, we don't have much need for bank financing because we get all the money we need out of Russia. And the writer says, really? And he says, yeah, we have some guys who are really invested in our programs over there, and we just go there all the time. Now, Eric denies the story, and Dodson sticks to it. And there are lots of plausible explanations for what happened here. Notably, there was a sale of a massive mansion in Palm Beach in 2008 for $95 million to a Russian oligarch. Okay, that was money that went into Trump's pocket right around the time that he was buying a lot of golf courses. So it sort of makes sense from that perspective. Also, Trump did have more than $100 million of funding because he had these membership liabilities. So it sort of makes sense from that perspective. Also, Trump had recently gotten a huge refinance at one of his office buildings that kicked off about $100 million to him. And so that would give him $100 million. So there are all these ways of making sense of it. Donald Trump goes to Moscow in 2013, the same year that this conversation allegedly took place. And as part of that trip, he goes to attend Miss Universe contest at Crocus City Hall, which is a big real estate development from a guy named Aris Agalarov, a real estate developer with connections to the Kremlin in Russia. As part of that trip, Donald Trump collects about $6 million in licensing fees. So that's another injection of Russian cash into the business at a time when Donald Trump was spending lots of money on golf resorts. Now, Donald Trump then becomes president in 2017, and the Russian investigation takes off immediately. So there aren't that many parts of Trump's business at that point that are all that transparent, that people can really learn all that much about. One part of it that you can see a lot about, however, are these European golf resorts that he's just started spending huge amounts of money on. There are filings that are required in both Ireland and in the UK that give much more detailed visibility into finances than anything that we have in the United States. And because Trump has some investments in those countries, journalists are able to see what the heck is going on. What they see are that Donald Trump is spending huge amounts of money and losing tons of money on the investments that he's plowing money into. And so people start to scratch their head and say, wait a second. So you have Eric Trump supposedly saying that they get all of their financing out of Russia. And you also have all of these really confusing investments into these golf resorts in Ireland and in Scotland. So how do we make sense of that? And people start connecting dots. And there's all these rumors about money laundering and could there be illicit funds. And the truth is that Donald Trump financed the construction of his golf empire through two methods. One are membership liabilities, and two are his own cash. And he had received enormous windfalls right before all of this spending that most people simply weren't aware of at the time. And if you look at those two financing mechanisms, it all makes sense. And you can sort of set aside this idea of Russian money laundering that had swirled around for so many years.
So really, really interesting reporting here, really interesting investigation. So what is the state of his golf and club portfolio today?
His golf business is absolutely on fire. Okay, so separate his golf business into kind of three different categories. First, you have U.S. courses and clubs. That part of the business is doing extremely well. Profits are at all-time highs in 2023. They've about tripled in 3 years coming out of the pandemic. All of a sudden, people are home. They want to be outside. They say, hey, I can go golfing and not infect my friends. So people start playing a ton of golf. Then they get hooked. Right now, anybody who's invested in golf before the pandemic has done extremely well, and that includes Donald Trump. Then you also have his Doral Golf Resort in Miami. So this is a massive resort, over 600 hotel rooms connected to 4 golf courses, also thriving. Then you have his European golf resorts. Those ones are not doing nearly as well, but they are finally starting to eke out some operating profits, making those years of huge losses look a little bit more manageable. But those still have been pretty questionable investments from the start.
Well, Dan Alexander, I certainly appreciate your reporting per usual. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.